None of this. A large and beautiful place in the Canadian tundra is completely away from the hustle and bustle of modern life. Nunavut, home to more than 28,000 Eskimos, gives tourists the opportunity to see their distinctive way of life, which is deeply rooted in culture and closely connected with the harsh natural environment. Sarah Johnson was so ecstatic when the plane landed at the entrance to the pond that she could hardly restrain herself. Belugas had always piqued her interest, and now she was one of 6 wildlife experts sent to observe these amazing animals in the wild. Landing a short distance from the rocky shore, the group soon set up camp. Nevertheless, there was a stunning view of the aquamarine waters from here. She asked the leadership of the local Eskimos about any risks that could affect their studies. The guy told her about a patch of ice and water near their camp, where, as is known, polar bears ate the corpses of seals. Unfortunately, it was a terrible assumption. The guide overlooked the fact that over time, some of the ice melted, which forced the local polar bears to spend more time on land in search of food. But Sarah had her 10mm Glock and a can of bear spray to calm her down. The sun was in the sky when Sarah and the others were preparing to catch a beluga whale. They worked quickly, accurately, and carefully, placing the net at a short distance from their tent. They decided to take turns working 3 to 4 hours every day to monitor the internet for signs of activity. When Sarah started her working day, she was left alone to watch the internet while the other researchers returned to their tent for a moment. Sarah was focused and kept a close eye on the internet in search of any activity. She was so engrossed in her work that she almost didn't notice a white figure appeared in the distance, awkwardly approaching her. The figure moved closer. Although Sarah knew it was a polar bear, it seemed strangely slender. He had shaggy hair and ribs were visible under the skin. The polar bear rushed at Sarah, causing her heart to beat wildly. She jumped up and waved her arms in the air, making as much noise as possible to scare the beast away, because she realized that she had to act quickly. The polar bear approached, but did not retreat. The gap narrowed until Sarah was only 40 feet away from her. Now it was clear that the polar bear was dying of hunger and was in a serious condition. Sarah immediately pulled out her Glock as soon as her instincts took over. The bullet she fired pierced through the bear's shoulder. But this only inflamed the fury of the polar bear. The bear suddenly came closer and jumped on her, throwing his huge carcass into the air. The bear hit Sarah with such fury that she collapsed to the ground. The bear's claws dug into Sarah's shoulders, causing her to feel excruciating agony. Darkness engulfed Sarah's world. The researchers were alerted by Sarah's shot, which made them rush in her direction. When they got to the scene, a terrifying sight awaited them. Their colleague was brutally torn apart by a huge bear that towered over him. The research team was completely shocked by the terrifying sight. Brandishing a firearm, he leveled his arm and shot the bear several times. The beast backed away before finally collapsing to the ground dead. Because of the severe injuries on her body, Sarah was difficult to recognize. The fact that she was still alive was a miracle. Scientists immediately got to work. Transcriptions were stitched. In the end, Sarah survived this terrible experience, but not without mental and physical scars. In any case, she was grateful to her colleagues for their help. She would have been eaten alive by a voracious polar bear if they'd arrived a little later. The date was August 20, 2012. Eager to go on to Svalbard, Victoria Cruz, Lila Rodriguez, and Ethan Cruz did it with great enthusiasm. The couple spent months organizing this trip as they were passionate explorers and environmental enthusiasts. Before their wedding in December of the same year, they went on this luxurious vacation. The great Arctic loomed before them. The couple were ecstatic as they excitedly scanned the cold sea for any signs of life in the hope of seeing polar bears, seals, and whales that were known to inhabit the area. The cruise approached the coastline of Kilauea, giving visitors a front-row ticket to one of the most exciting places on the planet, and they were speechless. The unspoiled beauty of the surroundings stunned Layla and Ethan as they stepped off the boat onto the cold coastline. An opportunity to enjoy the unique beauty and biodiversity of the Arctic. However, as the visitors soon realized, it was not an ordinary zoo. The local wildlife was uncontrolled, and it was allowed to roam freely on the frozen tundra. Some tourists started getting too close to the animals to take the perfect picture. In the distance, Lila and Ethan saw a flock of seals resting on the cold coastline. Lila and Ethan moved cautiously towards the seals with a sense of youthful awe. They were delighted with the beauty of the animals as they came closer and closer and closer. The two started photographing the seals while each had a DSLR camera in their hands. As they worked to get the best picture of the seals, Lila and Ethan's fingers clicked on their camera screens. They were so focused on their work that they didn't pay attention to the noise behind them. Lila and Ethan didn't notice that something was wrong until other visitors and tour operators started shouting and alarms sounded in their voices. Lila and Ethan were puzzled and looking for the cause of the mess, scanning the horizon. But it wasn't until they turned back that they saw a polar bear hiding, its huge body hidden by snow and ice. Just a few meters away from them, the sight of a huge polar bear was enough to make Lila and Ethan freeze. The bizarre, horrific scenario that was unfolding in front of them was difficult for their brains to comprehend. With shouts and loud noise, tourists and guides desperately tried to scare the bear away, but the animal was adamant. By the time Ethan tried to scare the bear away by chasing him, the animal had already jumped on Lila and knocked her hard to the ground. Lila was facing the bear, but the beast grabbed her by the head and mercilessly bit through the scalp. The unfolding, terrifying scene stunned the visitors. The guide then fired 6 more shots into the bear's shoulder, eventually wounding the huge animal so much that it fell. The wounded bear eventually fell to the ground and died. Ethan hurried to help Lila. Although she was badly maimed, she was still alive. The guides immediately asked for help. Soon after, a helicopter appeared. Lila was taken by helicopter to a nearby hospital where she needed immediate surgery. The bear almost grazed her vertebrae with its bite in the back of her neck, inflicting the most serious of her wounds. Fortunately, she has fully recovered from her injury. Story: One Yucca was a 17-year-old Inuit girl who lived in the small town of Avaia, situated on the western shore of Hudson Bay in the Canadian province of Nunavut. She had grown up in a traditional Inuit family that hunted, fished, and lived off the land. Yucca had learned the skills necessary to survive in this harsh and unforgiving environment, but nothing had prepared her for the attack she would face on that fateful day. It was a cold and snowy morning, like any other day in Arva. Yucca had just finished breakfast and was taking out the trash from her family's home. When she heard a loud growling noise, she turned around to see a massive polar bear charging toward her. Her heart skipped a beat and her mind raced as she tried to figure out what to do next. Yucca knew that polar bears were the top predators in the Arctic and that they could be incredibly dangerous. She had seen them from a distance many times before while hunting with her family, but she had never been this close to one. Yucca tried to run back inside the house, but the bear was too fast. The polar bear lunged at her and knocked her to the ground, and Yer was left defenseless. The bear began to mourn, Yer clawing at her body and biting into her flesh. She could feel the bear's powerful jaws crushing her bones and tearing her skin. Yucca knew she would die if she didn't fight back, so she summoned all her strength and kicked the bear in the face as hard as she could. The bear was momentarily stunned by the blow, and Yucca used that opportunity to crawl away. She knew she needed to get inside the house where she would be safer. Yucca managed to reach the door, but the bear was still after her and had grabbed her by the leg, pulling her back outside. Yucca's family had heard the commotion and had come outside to see what was happening. They saw Yucca struggling with the bear and immediately sprang into action. Yu's father grabbed his rifle and fired several shots of the bed, eventually killing it. He rushed over to Yucca and helped her inside the house where they immediately called for help. The local medical team arrived and transported Yucca to the nearest hospital. She had suffered severe injuries to her leg and back, and it took several weeks of intensive care and rehabilitation to recover fully. Yucca had to undergo several surgeries and was left with scars. That would remind her of the attack for the rest of her life. Despite the trauma she had experienced, Yucca was determined not to let the attack define her. She returned to her normal routine as soon as possible, continuing to hunt and fish with her family and participate in the traditional Inuit way of life. Yuka was hailed as a hero by her community for her bravery and resilience. Her story became a cautionary tale for others living in the Arctic about the dangers of polar bears. Story 2. Cecilia had lived in Newfoundland her entire life. She had seen harsh winters, bitter snowstorms, and freezing temperatures. She was used to the cold ice and snow. But she was not prepared for a polar bear breaking into her home. It was a typical winter evening when it happened. Cecilia was sitting by the fire missing a sweater for her granddaughter when she heard a loud banging on the door. She got up to see who it was, thinking it was probably her neighbor Sawyer, who often dropped by to check on her. But when she opened the door, she saw something that made her heart skip a beat. A massive polar bear was standing right in front of her. She froze, not knowing what to do. The polar bear growled and lunged at her. Cecilia tried to shut the door, but the bear was too strong. It pushed its way in and began warning her. Cecilia screamed, alerting her neighbor Sawyer, who was outside chopping wood. He rushed to her aid, armed only with an axe. When he saw the polar bear attacking Cecilia, he knew he had to act fast. Sawyer swung his axe at the polar bear, but it was just no match for the massive animal. The polar bear swiped at Sawyer, hitting him in the shoulder and sending him tumbling into the snow. Sawyer tried to get up, but the polar bear was on him instantly. Cecilia watched in horror as the polar bear mailed Sawyer. She knew she had to do something to help him. She crawled to her phone and dialed 911, praying they would arrive on time. But as she waited for the ambulance, Cecilia realized she could not just sit there and wait. She had to do something to save Sawyer. Cecilia crawled to her bedroom and retrieved a hunting rifle hidden in her closet. She knew using a gun was risky, but it was the only way to save Sawyer's life. She loaded the rifle and crawled back to the front door, where the polar bear was still attacking Sawyer. She took aim and fired at the polar bear, hitting it in the shoulder. The polar bear roared in pain and turned its attention to Cecilia. Cecilia fired again, hitting the polar bear in the head. The polar bear stumbled, then fell to the ground dead. Cecilia collapsed, exhausted and bleeding, which she had saved Sawyer's life, and for that, she was grateful. The ambulance arrived soon after and rushed Cecilia and Sawyer to the hospital. Cecilia suffered multiple injuries from the attack, but she miraculously survived. On the other hand, Sawyer suffered a broken collarbone and several lacerations, but was expected to recover fully. After the attack, Cecilia's story spread through the small town, and she became something of a hero. She was praised for her bravery, and her neighbors rallied around her, bringing her food, blankets, and other essentials to help her recover. Cecilia's granddaughter was particularly proud of her grandmother's bravery. She visited her daily, bringing her books to read and keeping her company as she recovered. Eventually, Cecilia returned to her home, but she was forever changed by the attack. She knew she had been lucky to survive and resolved to never take her life for granted again. Cecilia and Sawyer remained close, friends after the attack. They often reminisced about that fateful day and how they had survived against all odds. They both knew they had been lucky to come out of it alive and would never forget the bravery they had shown in the face of danger. Story 3. Adriel, Ivan, and Daisy were 3 scientists who had traveled from different parts of the world to conduct research at Torngay Mountains National Park in Canada. The mountains were known for their beauty and remoteness, and the trio was excited to explore this pristine wilderness. Their research involved studying the behavior and ecology of polar bears, and they had set up a base camp in a remote area of the park. They had been there for several weeks and had already collected vast data where they still had more work to do. One day while in the field, they spotted a polar bear in the distance. They observed it while taking notes and photographs, but the bear soon disappeared. They thought nothing of it and continued with their research, returning to their base camp. The next day, they spotted the same polar bear again. This time, it was much closer, and they could see it was agitated and aggressive. They tried to retreat slowly, but the bear charged, forcing them to flee. They managed to outrun the bear and return to their base camp, but they knew they were in trouble. They quickly set up a perimeter of tripwires and flares to deter the bear, but it was relentless. The bear circled their camp, growling and snarling, and even broke through their defenses a few times. For the next 3 days, Adriel, Ivan, and Daisy were terrorized by the aggressive polar bear. They could hear its heavy breathing and footsteps outside their tents, and they knew that at any moment it could break through and attack them. They barely slept, and their nerves were fray. Despite their fear, they came to level head and worked together to survive. They rationed their food and water and took turns keeping watch throughout the night. They also used their scientific knowledge to try and understand the bear's behavior and devise a plan to escape. On the third day, they decided they had to run for it. They knew that the bear was too aggressive to be deterred, and they had to get out of there before it was too late. They packed their gear and set off hoping to find help or reach a safer area. The bear pursued them relentlessly, but they managed to outsmart it by using flares and pepper spray to keep it at bay. They hiked for hours, exhausted and scared, but they knew they had to keep going. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, they stumbled upon a group of park rangers who were out on patrol. The rangers were shocked to see the trio covered in dirt and sweat, and they quickly realized that they had been attacked by a polar bear. They rushed them to safety, and the trio was treated for minor injuries and dehydration. Adriel, Ivan, and Daisy were lucky to have survived their ordeal. They were still grateful for their training and scientific knowledge, which helped them to stay alive. They were also thankful for the bravery and quick thinking of the park rangers who had saved their lives. After their experience, the trio returned to their homes, but they continued to study polar bears and their behavior. They were more determined than ever to learn about these magnificent creatures and to help protect them and their habitats. In the end, Adriel, Ivan, and Daisy's experience was a reminder of the power and beauty of nature and the importance of respect and caution. When exploring the wilderness, they would never forget their harrowing experience, but they were also grateful for the lessons and new perspectives they have gained. Story 4. Eric had always been an adventurous journalist. He traveled to different parts of the world to document people's lives and cultures. So when he got an opportunity to travel to Sunny Raja, a small Inuit community in the Canadian Arctic, he was excited. Eric had heard so much about the Inuit people and their way of life, and he wanted to capture their daily routines, traditions, and challenges. Living in such a harsh environment, it was challenging, but Eric was confident that he was up to the task. He arrived in Sunny Raja and was welcomed by the locals. He spent several days learning about their way of life and was fascinated by how they survived in such an extreme environment. The people were kind, and Eric felt he was part of their community. One day, Eric decided to hike to capture beautiful footage of the surrounding landscape. He packed his camera and some warm clothing and set out early in the morning. It was a beautiful day, and Eric enjoyed the fresh air and stunning views. As he was walking, Eric noticed something moving in the distance. As he got closer, he realized it was a polar bear. Eric had heard about polar bears and knew they could be dangerous. He tried to move away slowly, but the bear noticed him and started running toward him. Eric panicked and started running in the opposite direction, but he knew it was futile. The bear was too fast and caught up with him. Within seconds, the bear, Eric, biting him in the arm and legs and tossing them around like a rag doll. Eric was in excruciating pain and he thought he would die. However, something in him refused to give up. He fought back with all his might, hitting the bear with his camera and fists. The bear seemed annoyed and left Eric bleeding and battered on the ground. Eric was barely conscious when the Inuit people found him. They rushed him to the local hospital where he received medical treatment. He had severe injuries and the doctors were unsure if he would make it. The next few days were a blur for Eric. He was in and out of consciousness and had no idea what was happening around him. However, he knew he was alive, and that was all that mattered. After several weeks in the hospital, Eric was well enough to return home. He had lost some limbs and had scars all over his body, but he was alive. Eric was grateful for the second chance he had been given and vowed to make the most of it. Eric's story of survival made headlines, and he became a symbol of hope and resilience for many people. Eric had been tested in the most extreme circumstances and came out victorious. Eric returned to Sun Raja a few months later, accompanied by a team of experienced guides. He was determined to finish what he had started and wanted to capture the beauty and challenges of the Inuit people's daily lives. The trip was a success, and Eric's documentary received critical acclaim. He had captured the essence of the Inuit community and shown the world their struggles and triumphs. Eric had fulfilled his mission, and he had done it with courage and determination. Eric's experience changed him forever. He realized that life was precious and that every moment counted. He had faced death and had come out stronger on the other side. Eric had learned that no matter how bleak things might seem, there was always hope and a chance to start over. Story 5. Griffin had been a wildlife photographer for over 2 decades, traveling to the most remote and wild places on the planet to capture stunning images of the natural world. His latest assignment was a documentary on the effects of climate change in the Arctic, and he brought along Valerie, a seasoned journalist with a passion for environmental reporting. The two had been working together for weeks, capturing footage of melting glaciers, receding ice caps, and the fragile ecosystems of the polar regions. They had been camping in a remote part of the tundra near the sea's ice edge when they first encountered a mid-sized polar bear. At first, it was just a distant shape on the horizon, a blur of white against the blue sky. But as it drew nearer, they realized it was heading straight for them, moving quickly and purposefully. Griffin had worked with wild animals for years and knew how to handle himself, but Valerie was clearly terrified. Griffin instructed her to stay calm, but as the bear approached, it suddenly changed direction and charged straight at them. Griffin instinctively raised his camera to try and scare it off, but the bear was undeterred. It was only when Valerie started screaming and throwing stones that the bear hesitated, giving them a brief moment to retreat to their tent. They sat huddled inside for the next few hours, listening to the bear, circling their camp, snuffling and growling outside. They knew that polar bears were some of the most dangerous predators on the planet, capable of tearing through solid ice and taking down animals many times their size. Eventually, the bear moved off, and they emerged cautiously from their tent, only to realize it had torn apart their equipment and food supplies, leaving them stranded and vulnerable. Over the next few days, they'd try to survive on meager rations of dried food and snow, hoping rescue would arrive soon. But as the days passed, they grew increasingly desperate, and it became clear that they would have to take matters into their own hands. They decided to try and trek across the tundra to the nearest research station several miles away. They knew it was a risky proposition with no guarantee of success, but they had no other choice. As they set out, they could feel the icy wind biting their faces and the snow crunching beneath their boots. But they were determined to make it, pushing themselves to the limit as they trudged through the unforgiving landscape. As they neared the research station, they suddenly heard a loud snarling behind them. They turned to see the polar bear charging at full speed, its massive form silhouetted against the snow. They knew they could not outrun it, so they turned to face it head-on. Griffin grabbed a nearby rock ready to defend himself, but the bear was too fast. It lunged at him, tearing at his clothes with its massive paws and biting down hard on his arm. Valerie screamed and tried to distract the bear, throwing anything she could find at it, but it was no use. The bear had them both in its sights, and it was determined to kill them. But somehow, in that moment of desperation, they found the strength to fight back. Griffin managed to wrench his arm free, and they both pelted the bear with rocks, driving it back just long enough for them to make a run for the research station. When they finally stumbled through the door, battered and bruised, they collapsed into the arms of the researchers, grateful to be alive. It was a harrowing experience that would stay with them for the rest of their lives as they recovered from what had just happened. The two instantly fell unconscious as the researchers assisted them and gave them first aid for their injuries before calling emergency services to pick them up and transfer them to a hospital for further recovery.